While many of you may be familiar with the story of Don Quixote, a happy, silly tale about windmills and dragons and a brave yet foolish knight who runs about making himself a silly sort of a merry knight. Only a few know the true story of Don Quixote. The fake story, the one that was made up by his enemies to make him seem a fool, well, that was just a story made up by his enemies to make him seem a fool. But here, for the brave of heart, we have for you the true story of Don Quixote. This story was lost for a very long time. Long time. So long. But this story has been discovered anew by the man closest to Don Quixote, the man who wrote down in his journal exactly the true story of Don Quixote. Now, Don Quixote called this man Sombreros. The man himself called himself Sombreros. In truth, his name was Gabriel Marcos Miguel Juan Puentes Vaca de Santa La Mancha Enrique. But since no one in their right mind would go by that name, he instead chose for himself the name Sombreros. Why he wanted to name himself Hats in Spanish, no one's quite sure. But everything he says about Don Quixote is true. And we know this is the case because this story starts with everything about Don Quixote in the story is true. You see, Don Quixote is the true life embodiment of the warrior. He was born a warrior at birth. In fact, his mother, pregnant, very pregnant, was stolen by fiends just before she was about to give birth. They were going to enslave her. They threw her in the back of a wagon and took off with her. Now, she was afraid. She herself was a fighter, but of course, at 9 months pregnant, it's kind of hard to fight. However, in the back of that wagon, she gave birth to one Don Quixote. Now, you may not believe it, but Don Quixote came out of his mother. She held him in her arms, pulled her to him, looked him in the eye and said, "You are Don Quixote. You are my son." And little baby Don Quixote gave his mother a nod. Now, you may not believe that babies can give their mothers a nod, but this one can, and he did, because it's in this story. And Sombreros said everything in this story is true. So when the wagon came to a halt, and the men, the fiendish men, came around to unhook the wagon to remove the woman that they had stolen, they were met with the angriest baby they had ever seen. Now, Don Quixote was born with a gift that he would learn to hone later on in life, but he was born with it nonetheless. Now, what Don Quixote did as a baby is truly miraculous. For as they gazed into the back of the wagon, there he stood. Yes, stood, after only a few minutes old. In his right hand he held his umbilical cord, tied together like a whip. And he leapt from the carriage. I don't know how, but he did. He leapt from the carriage and used his umbilical cord. Whoosh, 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 whoosh. And all of the men ran away crying, for none had ever been whipped in the face with an umbilical cord before, and it was quite humiliating. Now, that's just the way he was born. So his mother took him and stole the wagon back and went back home, where she met up with his father, who, by the way, is named Don Guerra. Guerra is Spanish for war. Don Quixote's mother, well, her name was actually Don Quixote's mother. I guess that's how she knew to name him Don Quixote. And so the two of them raised Don Quixote, and he grew and grew, and became more and more lethal. By the age of 5, he had slain 25 foes. A truly miraculous feat. Now, it doesn't say, Sombreros doesn't know exactly who these foes were, or why a 5-year-old would kill them. But it's very menacing and very macho. He continued to grow, and by the age of 15, he enlisted himself in what was known as the Knights' Army. It was sort of like an army, but before there were armies. There were knights' armies, the armies of knights. And he began to train harder than ever. He became the best fighter, the most deadliest. He became Don Quixote, the knight. Now, one example of his amazing skills we will see here in this first edition. See, there was a second best knight who wanted to be the best. And one night while Don Quixote lay sleeping, unsuspecting, the second best knight grabbed Don Quixote very quietly, didn't even wake him, because Don Quixote can be a very heavy sleeper. He dragged him to a nearby tree, where with 3-inch thick rope, that's very thick rope, he tied Don Quixote to a tree from neck to knees, so tight that Don Quixote could not move. Then he woke him by splashing a cup of cold water in his face, a very rude way to wake someone up. Don Quixote looked around. It took him only a moment to realize what had happened, and he said, "Second best knight," for that was the man's name, "what do you think you're doing? I am Don Quixote, and you will not succeed at whatever it is you're trying to do to me." The second best knight looked at Don Quixote in the eye and said, "You are Don Quixote. I am tired of being second best knight." Don Quixote replied, "It's your name." The second best knight looked at Don Quixote with a pained expression. "Not anymore. I will now name myself the man who beat Don Quixote, tied him to a tree and killed him." Don Quixote stared at the man. "That's a stupid name," he said. The second best knight looked at Don Quixote. "You're right." They stared. "How about Quixote Slayer?" Don Quixote thought for a moment. "It's not bad," he said. "But how many Quixotes do you know? And once you slay the one, then it would just be the man who slayed Don Quixote, and there's no more slaying to be done. That's sort of like being the last dragon slayer after there are no more dragons." The man thought, "You're right. Even if I do succeed, how about no longer second best knight?" Don Quixote thought, "That works. Then I am no longer second best knight, and I will slay you, Don Quixote, and I will be the best." Don Quixote rolled his eyes. "You will try, no longer second best knight, but you will fail." No longer second best knight laughed a hearty laugh. "What will you do tied to a tree?" He pulled out his sword, a very, very long, very thick, very heavy sword, because he was making up for something. He pointed it at Don Quixote's chest, and with a scream began to run at him. But Don Quixote did not flinch. He didn't look scared. He didn't move a muscle. For Don Quixote was so incredibly macho. He feared nothing. Just then, his knack for turning anything into a weapon that he was born with, when he used his umbilical cord, kicked back in. He headbutted the tree behind him, and a single acorn fell. Fortunately, acorns fall faster than No Longer Second Best Knight runs, and the acorn dropped into Don Quixote's mouth. He smiled as he wellowed up inside a great blast of air, tickled his nose with his mustache hairs, and caused himself to sneeze. Achoo! The acorn flew. Right into the middle of No Longer Second Best Knight's forehead. The man went cross-eyed, fell to his knees, and dropped dead onto his own sword, which somehow had flipped around and stabbed him. Don Quixote simply looked at the dead man. You are no longer second best knight, just as I knew you would be. Then he used his teeth to chew his way out of the 3-inch thick rope and returned to his tent and fell asleep. And this is chapter 1 of the true story of Don Quixote.